Afrofuturism is a flavor of sci-fi that uses Black protagonists in otherworldly settings to teach its audience about the Black experience in their own world. One manifestation of Afrofuturism in fiction might be a response to whitewashed popular sci-fi that seeks to tweak its audience's mental picture to become more inclusive and instill pride. Another branch might seek to compare the experiences of Black protagonists in fictional situations to real-world experiences that its audience has either not experienced or not put words to. These works tend to be highly intersectional pieces with commentary on many facets of the African experience. These works touch on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, and many more. Two very prominent Afrofuturist works are the film Get Out and the novel Kindred by Octavia Butler, and they accomplish very similar messages through drastically different situations. Get Out is a thriller that begins as an awkward meet-the-parents weekend and develops into a daring escape from the 21st century equivalent of a slave plantation, where the Black people are lured into a white family's estate in order to have their bodies taken over by white, wealthy bidders. And Kindred is a sci-fi novel in which the protagonist Donna is teleported back to the 1800s on a former slave plantation in order to save a white slave owner's son who turns out to be her distant ancestor, during which she wrestles with having to save the man who will rape her great-grandmother so that she can be born. In Get Out, Chris experiences the awkward so-called non-racism of people who would vote for Obama a third time if they could. And eventually, this strange infatuation with Black people morphs into a new kind of slavery, one of the mind rather than the body. In neo-racism, there is an illusion or an expectation of safety. Afrofuturism seeks to dissolve this false security. In both of these works, the illusion is encapsulated by the false idea that there is a barrier of safety separating seeing and experiencing. This line between seeing racism carried out and experiencing racism is not as defined as we tend to believe. In the beginning of Kindred, Donna describes her trips to the 1800s as a strange sort of dream, almost as if she's looking through a glass window and not actually present. As her trips continue, she begins having more and more difficulty coming back from them, and starts to carry more and more scars from her time there. Her time at home is filled with her wondering when she would travel back, and what she would do if this or that happened. It becomes apparent that there's no way for Donna to observe these events without in some way being affected by them. And in Get Out, it's no coincidence that Chris is a photographer, a man who lives by seeing life through lenses. As he's being hypnotized, Chris is pictured in a black room looking at his life through a screen. His seeing literally becomes his experience, since all he can do in this captive state is look. As observers to these stories, we, the audience, start to wonder what we are seeing in our worlds that we are believing to be isolated from our lives. In neo-racism, previous goals or metrics of equality like civility or interracial relationships become new means of subjugation. As children, we learn to see marriage as the apex of unity and harmony. When two people love each other so deeply that they can't imagine being separate from one another, they get married. And at first glance, it seems like the ability for a Black person to be married to a white person ought to speak to how far we've come as a society. But as we grow up, we learn that there isn't always a happy ever after. And this once lofty ideal becomes humanized and messy. Marriage isn't always forever, and it isn't always so harmonious. And we see that racism exists beyond interracial marriages. And this isn't any new idea, but comparing a child coming to terms with this realization to ourselves and our society is what's so striking here. At the beginning of Kindred, Donna's marriage to Kevin stands in sharp contrast to the taboos of the 1800s. We see this union as a final triumph over the racism that plagues Donna's history. But as the novel progresses, this triumph is tainted by Kevin's self-seeking request for Donna to type his stories. And even later, when Kevin is transported to the 1800s with Donna, we see the biases of the time starting to rub off on him. We see that the violent visual racism of the 1800s wasn't completely done away with, and still permeates the current. In Get Out, Chris's girlfriend Rose starts out being supportive of Chris and advocates for him in the face of blatant racism. Even Rose's family appears enlightened and above the suspicion of racism. At times, their interactions with Chris are a little awkward, but we feel like we can still trust their intentions. Slowly, these interactions start feeling more and more unnatural and plastic. Eventually, we learn that Rose was luring Chris so that his family could imprison him, as she's done with dozens of previous boyfriends, who she keeps pictures of almost as trophies. And nearly every time we see Rose's mom, she's holding a cup of tea, which at first feels as a testament to her calm intellectualism and civil understanding. But later we find out that this very symbol of civility and peace turns out to be the very method of subjugation that she uses to hypnotize Chris. In both of these works, we see largely well-intentioned racism blurred with blatant racism of slavery and imprisonment. In Kindred, we see this line of observing versus experiencing racism blurred as we realize that Donna is not traveling between one racist world and one non-racist world. We see the exact same racism deeply permeating both worlds. In Get Out, we don't see well-intentioned racist people separated from blatantly evil racist people. They're frustratingly and confusingly mixed. Both of these creators are pleading for us to realize that we don't live in a post-racist world. The rottenness of the heart behind slavery is the same as that behind politicians who cater to the so-called marginalized and underrepresented populace while criminalizing minorities. All of these stem from a self-seeking heart without understanding, and this is unfortunately universally human. After each major civil rights breakthrough in history, there's been a lull period during which the populace is too enamored with the last step taken that they can't see how many more steps need to be taken. After emancipation, it took years for black freedom to be protected. After that, it took a while longer for black people to be allowed to vote. Then it took even longer for that to be enforced. Then it took a while for segregated areas to be integrated, and the list goes on. These stories show us that we have more work to do. The point of Afrofuturism is to teach us that the characters and stories in these outlandish worlds are not so different than that of our own. If it can happen there, then it's probably happening here. But are we able to see it?